Let's start with your recent trip overseas. What did you come back with, having been overseas engaging with, I believe it's the FBI, wasn't it? What did you come back with there?
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to have an opportunity to travel over to Pittsburgh, where the FBI have their cybersecurity centre, and they invited me over to have a look at the makeup of the centre. What impressed me the most was the way that the facility operated. In that, I mean, they had private industry embedded in with law enforcement, along with the forensic and analytics of that particular centre itself. You've got the FBI, Homeland Security, US Secret Service working hand in hand with the private sector, being the financial sector, the banking sector, and with their own forensic analytical ability and capability. That's something that I have an interest and something that I'm working with the private industry, particularly the banks at the moment here in New South Wales, along with the Australian Federal Police, because with cyber and fraud related crime, we no longer have borders. It's seamless, it's borderless, it's transnational. So we need to move in that type of landscape. The landscape's changed in terms of traditional crime. Whilst traditional crime is shown again and again, particularly in New South Wales, that it's being coming down and being reduced, what's not being communicated across and what we're not actually capturing is that that particular traditional crime is still occurring, but it's being facilitated through technology and different methodology by the organised criminal groups, and that means through cyber related activity, and that's not being reported and it's not being detected.
I've worked with operations that involve both business and law enforcement and found it easier to operate them on an ad hoc, unofficial level. It's just easier to build the relationships. It seems to me as soon as you get involved with officially with someone like a law enforcement agency, you suddenly get bogged down in bureaucracy. And what you're talking about and what we're quite often facing is we're fighting networks, and you're not going to fight networks with the bureaucracy. So how do you overcome that in your day-to-day work?
It's about building trusted relationships and how we communicate and exchange information. It's about exchanging information between the various agencies, and not law enforcement only in government, but the private sector, building that trust and relationship where we can get on the phone, talk to somebody, exchange information which may be of interest to us. And that's what I got out of the way that they operated over in the United States. That trust and building of relationships where they could go up to somebody and say, look, I've just discovered this, I think it may be of interest to you, you want to have a look at it. And that's the way that I like to operate here in New South Wales. There's certainly a cultural shift to be done, with shifting paradigms, I guess. The way that I see it, law enforcement and or security is not just our responsibility. It's the business community and the community itself, the general community, all have a responsibility not only to be educated but to contribute in relation to reducing whatever that may be, whether it be crime or whether it may be the incidence of crime, whatever that may be. We all have to contribute, and we all have to form that partnership to work along those lines. Otherwise, we're not going to achieve the end goals that we're after.
How does this work on a day-to-day basis for you in your day job?
We're in the process of co-locating with the Australian Federal Police. This is my cybercrime unit. In that respect, why that's important is because, as I said earlier, the landscape has shifted. There are no more borders. Australian Federal Police provide us with the opportunity, with their liaison officers, to communicate right around the world. With the advent of technology, particularly in relation to cyber, apart from providing that anonymity, you can have somebody committing some tremendously huge crimes and serious crimes from their own room. That changes the landscape considerably, where traditionally we had somebody, for instance, going into a bank committing an armed robbery. That's now reduced to an insignificant level. Whilst it still occurs, it's reduced to the extent where it's minimal. So now you've got the landscape where you have individuals through the cover of anonymity, can be anywhere in the world and can take your money, my money, anytime they want to. The other aspect of it with fraud and technology is that it's important to build those partnerships with the private sector. As I said earlier, building the partnerships with the banks initially and the financial sector is very important, because we all have an interest in that. Law enforcement, we can't do it on our own. We rely on the security, we rely on government, and we rely on other law enforcement agencies. The way that the environment is changing with technology, we're now more towards transnational crime. So we all have to get together and work collegiately and collaboratively if we're going to be able to have an impact on that. At the moment you have cyber, CT, organised crime. That's all interrelated. One works through the other. And we need to understand that and work towards that if we're going to be able to achieve the reduction in that particular type of crime type, because it impacts right across our environment, both economically, financially and criminally.
Now, when you talk about cybercrime, people instantly go, oh, that's all technical stuff and involving techies. But a huge part of it is human factors and people understanding how they're using technology. How are you going about addressing that with organisations?
That's an interesting and important question because it's about education and awareness. Not only educating the private sector, but educating the community, particularly the most vulnerable, because I see it there's three particular groups in the community. You have your baby boomers who really didn't grasp technology until adult life, and they're probably more self-conscious about the way they protect their identity and security. The Generation X, which probably grew up with technology in their teens, are sensible about it and are our future leaders. Then you have Gen Y, who basically have grown up with Google and Facebook being a great part of their life, the way they socially interact with each other. But anecdotal evidence shows and research that they're a lot more complacent with their privacy and their security. So that's something that we really want, the message we want to send out is about being very aware of the information you're putting up on some of these social websites, because you're exposing yourself and your company and industry that you work in.
Sharing is generally meant to be a two-way process. Quite often, when you're involved with intelligence and law enforcement, I have found that companies are more than happy to cooperate and work with law enforcement or intelligence, but they get no feedback. And there are restraints around law enforcement offering that feedback or intelligence offering that feedback. Is that another cultural change? Is that something we're going to have to accept in order for this to happen? We've got to figure out how we create that trusted relationship?
I do believe so. Apart from being a cultural change, there's also some legal implications because, you know, depending on the law enforcement agency you're with, there's some very sensitive information, classified, protected and top secret information, which obviously we can't share, and only certain people who have those clearances are allowed to get access to that information. But that doesn't stop us or prevent us from being able to sharing information which may impact on a particular company. And similar to what I saw over in the United States, particularly with the Sony hacking, the FBI, the way they worked, I found it was very, very professional in that they didn't have the skill set or the capability to be able to solve a lot of that. They knew what they required from a law enforcement perspective in order to be able to prosecute the offenders that may have been responsible for it, but they didn't have the capability to be able to do the technical aspects. So what did? They moved their FBI agents in with Sony and use Sony's IT capability and their forensic analysts to be able to do a lot of that IT work for them. So that's a good way of cooperation, collaboration between a law enforcement agency and the private sector.
It sounds like an exciting time to be in your area of work. What keeps you up at night?
Many things. Lack of resources is one, of course. But moving with the landscape, I think it's about influencing up, changing the culture, both not in our organisation, in government as well. A lot of people don't realise the impact of cyber and fraud, and as I said earlier, that's the growth industry at the moment. It's really flourishing, the landscape's all changed, and I don't believe we're keeping up with it. Our greatest challenge in security is to be able to influence government in terms of legislative reform and resources in those areas, because it's no longer an emergent crime type. It's here and it's advancing at an exponential rate.
Do you think the government or the public actually realises how horrific this situation is? It's a bit like cancer. You don't know you've got cancer until usually it's too late. Is that the sort of situation we're sitting in here?
That's a great analogy. It's true. It creeps up on you, and before you know it, it hits you, and really then you've got no real response to it. So I guess what we're going to try and do is prepare ourselves to be ready for it. It's not about cyber-getting type of thing, but if we're not prepared, and that is moving in with the right legislative reform, collaboration and partnerships with industry, both private and government and law enforcement. And again, we need the community. We need to be able to educate the community and make them aware. That's one of our greatest challenges. You're right, the community doesn't realise the implications about the information that they're putting out on the social websites. And the criminals now, information is very valuable to them. Many of the criminals that surf the net, for instance, look for information where they can not only take over your identity, but be able to get access to your bank accounts, bank records, and they're taking out millions of dollars from economies right around the world. That's one of the greatest challenges for us in law enforcement and for government and the private sector. We all have a role to play.
There's also another factor involved that's not necessarily directly involved in what you're talking about, but it's sort of related, and that's the changing nature of the way we do business. We see online services appear all the time, like Uber or Airbnb, and people don't realise the crime implications there. For example, Airbnb, the German police threatened to have them kicked out of Germany and banned in Germany because of the number of human traffickers that were using their online room booking service. Interestingly, the other day I was watching the Gruen Transfer, and two people, that's a program about the media, and two people from the advertising industry said that what we need is to have risk management embedded at the development stage of these services. And I found that interesting that we're talking that people outside of the field we're in are suddenly talking about what we need is risk management. Would that be a good place for you to go, to talk to people like that?
Absolutely. I think that's a very valid point. It's something that we raised at a group forum recently in terms of the banks, for instance, if I can use an example. The technology that they create, we believe that law enforcement and security need to be able to come in at the ground level when they're introducing the technology and at least have some input into how it progresses, because it's going to impact on all of us. For instance, there's some talk that in the future, next 5 or 10 years, we'll no longer have credit cards. That credit cards will be taken away and we'll be using our mobile devices, ChipPIN technology with tokens. That's going to create other issues for us in law enforcement. How do we deal with that? How do we work with industry to overcome some of those issues which we're going to be faced with in the not too distant future? So having that early approach and input into it is going to be a very important factor.
Because the bad guys can move quicker than we can. We have to test technology, we have to make sure it works properly, we have to make sure it's legal and acceptable and safe. The bad guys don't have to do anything, they just know how to defeat it. You mentioned chip and pin. One of the easiest technologies to defeat in the UK has turned out to be chip and pin.
From a law enforcement perspective, and I guess from a government perspective, we're continually chasing our tail. They're always one step ahead of us. Technology, particularly now, is advancing, from what I've seen from my perspective, such an exponential rate. What took 20 years to come across in the last 50 years, now can be done within 3 years. So we're getting better at it. We've got the technology to advance very, very quickly, and that poses a real threat and challenge to, as I said, not only law enforcement, the government and the private sector, and that's why it's important that we get that mind shift now and start working collectively and collegiately so we can tackle this problem, because we're not going to do it on our own.
Yeah, I'm from WA. I work for a major retailer over there, well not a Woolies or a Coles, but I find attending police theft forums that the major retailers are willing to throw their resources out there collectively. That's the security wing of the companies. However, the police, I feel, they haven't developed a system to be able to collect that, to be that third party, to collect that information and to disseminate that information back through retail. Because obviously what happens is that the scammers and the fraudsters and whoever else, they'll go to Coles, they'll make their dough, Coles will finally get onto them, and then they'll move to Woolies and they'll keep moving on. So they, in the present climate, the scammers and the fraudsters, they're going to win every time. They just move on to the next victim. And what I've found is that the police, being that third party or the parent, the retailers are willing to give you their resources, and obviously you were talking about the police being underfunded. Retail is not underfunded in resources, but they need a third party or a parent to go through, and that would be the police. But you guys, at the moment, I don't feel you're up to getting that information and making use of it to the satisfaction, even for privacy. because obviously private sectors, they're competitive beasts and they will not, in the present climate, share information.
It's a good question because from my perspective at Fraud and Cybercrime, we do work very closely with industry. Whilst it may not be retail industry, we work with the financial institutions. So when we get information from the certain financial institutions about a scam or a particular crime that's happening, what we do, we produce a fraud alert or a bulletin alert where we disseminate it very quickly, not only to all our local area commands, our other specialist commands, but industry itself, be aware of this, and then using the media as well to highlight to the community that this is happening, be aware of it, and this is what you can do to reduce the incidence of that occurring to yourself. We do have the mechanism, we do use it, but again, it's a big cultural shift, and we do have a lot of laws. I think it was mentioned by some of the earlier speakers in terms of protecting privacy and the like, and that's something that, you know, we have to work with government to try and overcome and provide industry and the community with the expectations of, okay, this is what we do, and this is how we're going to be able to assist you as a community from a law enforcement perspective.
That feedback loop is I think going to be your biggest challenge, is the ability to, in one area of illicit trade we were working on, the feedback loop we had figured out was, well, what information can you publicly share? And one of the pieces of information they could share was letting them know when a case was going to court. So the people could make their own, you know, they've provided information to law enforcement, months go by, and then they get a notification back saying you might be interested in this case coming up at court. And they could make their own connection. But probably it is about attitude too. I suspect that's what's happening in Perth too. It's easy to hide behind, oh, there are privacy laws. Well, that doesn't fix the problem. Change the privacy laws.
Oh, exactly. And it is a mind shift, it's a paradigm shift, which we all have to get acquainted with, because if we don't do that, we're not going to be able to cope with the methodologies of the way that crime's trending, but, you know, with some of the issues that are happening societally with, as we see now with CT, organised crime, the way that they've, you know, grown in exponential fashion with drugs, the use of the dark net and the onion router, where a lot of crime is occurring, and we really haven't even touched the iceberg. I remember speaking to one of the FBI agents who was involved in bringing down Silk Road on the dark net. Their role was basically working 24/7 on a laptop with the identity of Master Splinter and communicating with the people online over a 14-month period to, you know, build up a legend and make sure that they were convinced they weren't a police officer. And in the end, when they did the resolution phase, and I can talk about this now because it's actually out and books have been written about it, but it was interesting talking to that individual who was actually personally involved in it, and the time it took to be able to, you know, going down to the beach with the family but being on the laptop. This is how we've got to change in law enforcement, to be able to change our methodologies and be able to move with the environment and the landscape, and that's moving very quickly, and it's left us behind, so we really need to catch up.
In the United States, the Russian, they call them the Russian Mafia, but the Mafia have, what they've done is taken up leases on petrol stations right down the California coast, well, all the way up to Canada, and they skim 5 cents, say, off each credit card that anyone uses. The problem is they have a federal system, same as ours. And there seems to be jurisdictional issues about who's going to buy into it, because it's a real issue from a cost-benefit analysis basis of chasing a fraud that's worth 5 cents. But if you add it all up over a period of time, it amounts to millions. Then it's ongoing every day, 24/7. What's going to happen in this country when those cross-jurisdictional issues arise and between the different policing agencies? Who's going to take responsibility for some of those cross-jurisdictional frauds that take place?
As you know, that state-based jurisdictions also have the ability to work with the Commonwealth legislation. So if we choose to take that up, we can work it. Depends on the circumstances and the crime. If we find that a particular crime is working, credit card skimming, for instance, which is quite big in New South Wales and right across Australia, we've worked on some large Romanian gangs that have come over here, have been credit card skimming, not only New South Wales, but crossing borders into Melbourne, over into Brisbane, and across into South Australia and West Australia. It's about working with our fellow jurisdictions and making sure that we can combine our resources to make the arrests and identify those individuals, because We can do that, and certainly we'll have responsibility for our own jurisdictional matters, but then it's been able to pass that information on to our fellow law enforcement colleagues so they can act on them in their particular jurisdictions. It's an area that, well, I was talking about the cultural shift earlier, that we have to combine our resources, and that is, as I said before, I saw it as very beneficial for us to work with the Australian Federal Police, for instance, because they have the umbrella over the whole Commonwealth, but not only the Commonwealth, on a global basis, and working together with them to be able to have that connection with international law enforcement, and that's, I believe, the way forward moving into the future.
You've also had some pretty good successes in that cross-jurisdictional cooperation on targeting crime on the waterfront, with the likes of Trident, Polaris and so on through the various states, also working with Customs, also working with the Taxation Department, tackling crime on the waterfront. So there are models that you can look at.
There's some very successful models, fusion centres and models, as you said, like Polaris, for instance. That's been very, very successful, and I think that's what we've got to look to work going into the future, because you can see from those particular models that that's where crime has evolved, that's where organised crime is taking place, and all those law enforcement partnerships are very important in order for us to be able to achieve our final objectives and outcomes, and that's targeting these individuals and arresting them and prosecuting them.